For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the ranking member of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
House Resolution 869 provides for a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 5893, the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act, and a closed rule, H.R. 5961, the No Funds for Iranian Terrorism Act. We have a structured rule for H.R. 5893, which makes in order 119 amendments for consideration on the floor. This rule provides the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations limited en bloc authority and provides one motion to recommit. We have a closed rule for H.R. 5961. Debate for this bill will be evenly divided over 1 hour between the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the rule provides one motion to recommit. I urge members to support H.Res. 869 and the spirit in which it was created, one that allows for robust debate and gives members the opportunity to submit amendments for consideration on this floor. As many amendments were included in this rule as possible, we are encouraging debate on the floor and for members to fight for their priorities. There's absolutely no reason not to support this rule. And let's not forget what we have been committed to fighting for these last several months, bringing all 12 appropriations bills to the floor. The days of Christmas omnibus bills are over. We still have more work to do to fight against inflated budgets and the growing national debt. But the step we are taking this week that prevents a Christmas giveaway on the House floor in an omnibus is a major step in the right direction. This is what the American people expected of us. This is what we were elected to do: discuss and debate appropriation of taxpayer dollars. And speaking of appropriations, this is our 12th appropriations bill. 12 of 12, finally, here we are. Do I wish this were done in a timelier manner? Of course. Do I wish the government functioned more efficiently for the sake of the constituents we each represent? Absolutely. But we find ourselves now completing this process in the manner in which it was intended: draft, amend, debate, and vote. No member can say today that they did not have the opportunity to participate in this process, and no member can argue that these appropriations were not brought forward in an open and transparent manner. I applaud the relative committees and everyone in the GOP conference who has worked so hard to bring this bill and all of the appropriations bills forward to get this work done. I urge my colleagues to support the rule, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Good morning, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. So, Madam Speaker, you heard the gentleman from Kentucky purport to describe what is in the bills that we are considering today, and I think his description of these bills is somewhat inaccurate. The so-called No Funds for Iranian Terrorism Act, and I say so-called because this bill does not actually do what the title suggests. It's really just about Republicans going after President Biden because they're mad he secured the release of American hostages. It's as simple as that. Some members of Congress would rather let these American hostages stay imprisoned in Iran than give credit to President Biden for bringing them home. This is a bad bill. It undermines America's credibility in future negotiations. And the money the United States unfroze, Iranian money, not American money, can only be used for humanitarian needs. That's the truth. The money doesn't even go to the Iranian government. It goes to a restricted account in Qatar where it can be only used for approved purchases. Those are the facts. And I won't waste any more time on this foolish political messaging bill. The other bill contained in this rule is H.R. 5893, another extreme MAGA Republican spending bill. It's no shock that this radical Commerce, Justice, and Science appropriation bill couldn't even get a markup and a vote out of the full Appropriations Committee because it's nuts. It defunds the police, which is ironic, but let's not even go there. And it cuts programs that help small businesses, slashes services that help missing and exploited children. I mean, really? And it makes it easier for criminals to get their hands on guns. Madam Speaker, the truth is that the Republican Party is completely and totally broken. They are unable to govern themselves, let alone a country. And the two extreme MAGA messaging bills that we are considering today are just the latest examples, just the tip of the iceberg. Now, our job on the Rules Committee is to help run this place like professionals, to advance legislation in a thoughtful, orderly, deliberate manner, and to do it in a way that reflects well on the Congress and the country. But since Republicans took over, we have seen nothing but dysfunction and disaster in this chamber. Chaos, confusion, and crisis at the hands of MAGA extremists who have turned this place into a circus. Republican incompetence over the last 11 months takes my breath away. As this chart shows, Madam Speaker, we have a timeline up here that speaks for itself. A week wasted on 14 failed votes for Speaker, while Kevin McCarthy agreed to shady backroom deals with MAGA extremists so he could win the gavel. A month wasted on MAGA extremists threatening to default on America's debt unless Democrats agreed to draconian spending cuts. An entire summer wasted after Democrats came to the table and negotiated a budget deal, but then Republicans didn't bring a single spending bill to the floor. Finally, days before a government shutdown, Republicans brought to the floor appropriations bills they couldn't even pass. They had to call in Democrats to get a continuing resolution over the finish line. And then they kicked out their own speaker for the terrible crime of keeping the government open. All because the MAGA extremists had a temper tantrum. 20 days wasted while Republicans argued amongst themselves until they finally settled on someone who, evidently, everybody in their conference disliked the least. And here they are today, Mr. Speaker, right back where they started, with nothing to show the American people except dysfunction and disarray. We heard promise after promise from Republican leaders that this Congress would be different, more open and more accommodating, we kept on hearing. Those promises have been broken. Over 40 closed rules on the floor, blocking 68% of bipartisan amendments. And by the way, even blocking over half of all Republican amendments. My friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massie, 20% of his own amendments have been blocked, never even considered on the floor. I have a radical idea that in the world's greatest deliberative body, we should, deliberate. Yet, time after time, despite their promises, Republicans are blocking amendment after amendment. And again, two-thirds of bipartisan amendments, and over half of their own amendments have been blocked. Don't worry, though. They found a way to make an order every single MAGA culture war amendment to ban abortion and go after women's reproductive rights. They tucked those into nearly every appropriations bill. And you would think that after all of that, at least they would have something to show for it, right? You'd be wrong. At this point in the 116th Congress, when Democrats were in charge during divided government, we had already enacted 68 laws, not just passed the House, but enacted into law, signed by the President. So far, this Congress, Republicans have acted 19 laws. That's it. Let that sink in. Democrats enacted over 3 times the number of laws at this point in our majority. Maybe, and here's an idea, maybe they would have had more bills signed into law if they didn't waste all their time fighting with one another. But instead, they wasted an entire month, 26 days so far, fighting with themselves, holding midnight seances, trying to revive the dead bills that divided their conference, and fighting a MAGA civil war about who should be in charge. 14% of all legislative days this Congress have been focused not on the American people, but on which one of them gets to be in charge. That's a national embarrassment. You know how many days it took Democrats to pick a speaker when we were in charge, Mr. Speaker? One. Because Americans expected us to govern, not fight with each other. Which reminds me, it's not like we don't have a recent example of what it looks like when Congress gets stuff done in a productive and bipartisan way. So now, let's compare their record this Congress with our record last Congress. Republicans have made fewer bipartisan amendments in order. Hell, they've made fewer majority amendments in order, and only 19 bills signed into law. Again, we have a recent example of what this place looks like when it works. Democrats enacted 58 laws last Congress, signed by the President at this point. I said a moment ago that it was 68 under divided government. It was 58 in the last Congress, because we get things done no matter who is in the White House. We take our job seriously. The facts speak for themselves, and the contrast could not be more clear. Because this right here, this is what Democratic leadership looks like in Congress. It looks like results for American families. Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, ending the COVID crisis and reopening our economy. Democrats passed the CHIPS and Science Act, bringing jobs back from China and supply chains back from overseas. Democrats passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a historic investment that will rebuild our infrastructure for generations and generations to come. And what did almost every single Republican do on every single one of those bills? They voted no. But guess what? They're in charge now. And instead of rising to the occasion, they have totally failed at governing. They are running this place like babies. Actually, I think that's an insult to babies, Mr. Speaker. Their incompetence is staggering. Their infighting is so immature that it's stunning. All the American people want, Mr. Speaker, is for Republicans to work with Democrats to get things done. It's that simple. It's that simple. Republicans barely control one half of one branch of government. Democrats control the Senate and the White House. To get anything done, anything at all, we all have to work together. We have to compromise. We have to do things in a bipartisan way. And that's, quite frankly, what the American people want. They want us to put people over politics to get stuff done. And that's what Democrats are focused on. And I can tell you, people are fed up with this Republican dysfunction and disarray. They are fed up with Republicans fighting with each other instead of for the people. They are fed up with Republican leadership caving to the MAGA extremists time after time after time. And I'm telling you right now, this majority will not be in the majority for long if things keep going like they have been. And with that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, to say that the Democrats spend like drunken sailors is an insult to sailors. This bill cuts wasteful spending. If there's any scorecard to be kept between Democrat speakers and Republican speakers, well, it should be on spending. And I'd like to note that 40% of all of the national debt, which, by the way, is approaching $34 trillion, 40% of all of the national debt that exists today, from the beginning of our country until this moment, was incurred under one speaker. That was Speaker Pelosi. So if we're keeping score here, it should be about spending, wasteful spending, deficit spending, and debts. And we can blame presidents for it, but the reality is Congress, in fact, the House of Representatives, has the power of the purse. We need to look at ourselves when we look at that debt. And this bill is a good step toward reducing deficits. The Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill provides net new spending of $58.383 billion for programs under the jurisdiction of the subcommittee, which is $23.765 billion below FY23 enacted levels. That's a large cut. Maybe it's not large enough, but it is what has upset the other side of the aisle, that's for sure. You can disguise it as anything you want, but they're really upset about this bill because it cuts spending. Not the kind of cuts to spending where we pretend to cut spending, where we have some baseline that's actually increasing spending and then we reduce the baseline. No, I'm talking about actual cuts in real dollars. That's what this bill does, and that's why they're so excited. That's why they're so angry about this rule and this bill. By the way, this rule allows for 119 amendments. And when they say those are extreme amendments, what do those amendments do? They cut more. That's what the amendments do. None of those amendments increase spending. I think that's what they're upset about on the other side of the aisle, is that not only have we brought forth a bill that cuts $23 billion of federal spending, we're allowing 119 amendments to cut even more spending. So let me talk about the priorities in this bill. By the way, Congress has the power of the purse. And we complain about a lot of things the executive branch does. But then we too will frequently turn around and fund the things that we complain about. So this bill actually defunds some of the things that we've been complaining about. You know, I had the great fortune to share breakfast with Justice Antonin Scalia before he passed away, several members of Congress. And one of my colleagues asked the Justice Scalia, he said, "When are you going to help us restore constitutional balance of government?" And Scalia scoffed at him. He said, "What are you talking about? You are the most powerful branch. In fact, every tool you need is right there in the Constitution to restore constitutional balance of government." And another of my colleagues said, "But impeachment is so unwieldy and we can never get that through the Senate." And Scalia said, "I'm not talking about impeachment. I'm talking about the power of the purse. It's right there in the Constitution. You have it. You are the most powerful branch, and quit complaining about the things you're funding, or quit funding the things you're complaining about." And so that's what this bill does. It eliminates more than 70 unnecessary and wasteful programs and initiatives, including 14 polarizing diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and programs. I don't find diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Constitution. It's just not in Article 1, Section 8. It's not there for us to do. And so we're eliminating those programs. Defunds at least 15 executive orders. What are executive orders? Are they laws? No, they're not laws. The lawmaking authority is here. We should probably defund every executive order, but this defunds 15 of them. Rules, memoranda, and other Biden administration policies that usurp our congressional authority to make law. This bill reduces wasteful spending on climate change initiatives, prevents the FBI from using its construction balances to build a new headquarters. Why is that important? Because they've become weaponized against the American public. When they start showing up at school board meetings and targeting parents and saying that they're terrorists, they don't need a new headquarters. And it rejects the administration's plans to replace the Department of Commerce and Department of Justice vehicle fleets with electric vehicles, saving taxpayers nearly $54 million. This is what we're doing in this bill. We're using the power of the purse. There are 119 amendments. None of those amendments increase spending. I can tell you we went through all of them. Maybe that's why they're so upset that some of their amendments didn't make it in there, because maybe they were trying to spend more money. I'm sorry, we're not going to do it. And with that, I reserve.
Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think for the viewing public who is watching this, they may take note that the gentleman didn't respond to anything that I said in my opening remarks. I will point out for the record, just so people understand, that over half of the amendments that were offered to this bill were rejected. They were blocked. They were blocked by the Republican majority on the Rules Committee. 170 amendments, many of them Republican amendments, I should point out, were blocked. And it was not because they added to spending, they were just blocked. And the point I was trying to make, and I'll make it again, is that my friends on the other side of the aisle, my complaint with them is they have accomplished absolutely nothing. They have wasted their time in the majority. The gentleman talks about all these deep cuts in some of these appropriation bills that, I'll be honest with you, I object to them because they're going to hurt people I represent, but he talks about all these cuts. None of these bills are ever going to become law. We spent all of last week debating 2 appropriations bills, the transportation bill and the financial services bill. I mean, we worked overtime, late into the night, debating all these amendments. And guess what? They pulled them. They pulled them. They're in the majority. They can't even pass the crummy bills that are being sent from Appropriations Committee to the Rules Committee. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. And the bill we're talking about today, I'm not even sure this is going to pass, or I wouldn't be surprised if they pull this and the labor HHS bill as well. I mean, this is not how you run Congress. We're supposed to bring things to completion. The bill before us today was so bad the full Appropriations Committee didn't even mark it up. Why? Because they probably couldn't get the votes to get it out. You know, so my friends have accomplished absolutely nothing in their majority. I mean, that's a tragedy. I mean, they've barely struggled to do the basics, like keeping the lights on, but they need Democratic help to do that. And they've blocked the majority of their own members' amendments. You can't make this stuff up. 20% for Mr. Massie. I mean, and the gentleman who's on the Rules Committee had a big chunk of his amendments blocked as well. But in any event, Mr. Speaker, we're going to urge on our side that we defeat the previous question. And if we do, I will offer an amendment to the rule to provide for consideration of a measure that unequivocally states that the People's House will keep its promise to American workers and seniors, that we will protect and preserve Social Security and Medicare and fight against any Republican cuts to these essential programs that so many of our constituents rely on. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with any extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And to discuss our proposal, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. McGovern.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Social Security and Medicare are a lifeline for hundreds of thousands of seniors in my district in Louisville, Kentucky, and for millions of seniors across America. Unfortunately, the House Republicans continue to advocate for stripping hardworking Americans of their earned benefits. I stressed earned. Social Security and Medicare they're a contract, a legal and a moral promise that our country has made for people who have paid into a program and then said, guess what? We'll be there for you. We'll be there to provide a safe and secure retirement for you in your golden years. And for millions of Americans, a Social Security check is the difference between keeping the lights on or falling behind on bills. Their Medicare coverage is the difference between taking or not taking their insulin. Stripping back these crucial benefits is dangerous and it's extreme. But just a few weeks ago, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle explicitly stated that they wanted to elect a speaker who has the courage to talk about ending Social Security and Medicare as we know it. My hometown in Louisville, Kentucky is home to more than 350,000 Medicare beneficiaries. That's over 350,000 Louisvillians who paid into the program their entire working lives so that they could depend on those benefits now. Thanks to Democrats and the Inflation Reduction Act, healthcare is more affordable and more accessible than ever before. As we speak, Medicare is negotiating to lower the price of 10 prescription drugs for Part D recipients, with more to come. And out-of-pocket insulin costs have been capped at $35 a month. There's more to do. But extremists in the House Republican Conference are trying to privatize, cut, and end these crucial programs. House Democrats will continue fighting to protect these benefits for generations to come. I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Well, I'd like to point out that my colleague from Kentucky is right, that Social Security is a legal and moral obligation to seniors. But I'd also like to point out that every time we engage in deficit spending and we spend too much money, we cause inflation. And then when we have the Fed create dollars out of thin air so we can launder them through banks and then borrow them back from ourselves, we're really causing inflation. And what does inflation do to those Social Security checks? It reduces the value of those Social Security checks. So this bill is actually a step at reducing inflation by reducing federal spending. And that will be to the benefit of those seniors who are going to be living on a fixed income. And we all know there's a cost of living adjustment applied to Social Security, but the reality is it's not keeping up with inflation. Inflation is so rampant now due to the spending that we have engaged in Congress. There's a moral imperative for us to reduce spending because it trickles down. It trickles down. The inflation is very detrimental to our seniors, and that's why we have to pass this bill. And at this point, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend and colleague on the Rules Committee from New York, Mr. Langworthy.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, first I'd like to thank the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding the time. And I rise today to support of the underlying legislation to prevent the Biden administration from following through on its policy of appeasement towards the Iranian regime. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle insist that there are safeguards to ensure that the $6 billion unfrozen in the administration's agreement with Iran is spent purely on humanitarian efforts. But I ask my colleagues and I ask this administration, if there is such an urgent need for access to that money for food and medicine and other assistance, then why has the Iranian regime invested for decades billions and billions of dollars into funding Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations that are intent on murdering Americans, murdering the Jewish people, and destroying our friend and ally, the State of Israel? The administration has lost its mind if they think that it can appease a fundamentalist regime that routinely calls for our annihilation and the annihilation of the Jewish people. On October 7th, we saw pure evil on display as Hamas, bankrolled by this Iranian regime with funds that could have been spent on food, medicine, or other humanitarian needs of the Iranian people. They murdered, they kidnapped children, they raped women, they brutalized the elderly. The evil we saw on that day was done at the behest of and with the resources provided by Iran's fundamentalist leaders. And I want to remind you that there are still 240 hostages in Gaza, including 10 Americans. Yet some of my colleagues continue to insist that this $6 billion deposit to the regime in the form of aid will not be used for malicious purposes. I think we all know that it will. We know that this administration has followed an utterly failed path of appeasing an evil regime in Iran. And the true cost of this failure is the violence and the chaos brought upon the Israeli people by the Iranian-funded terrorist group Hamas. Enabling Iran to fund terror goes against every principle our nation has been founded on. It rejects freedom, democracy, justice, and empowers fear, division, and hatred. Appeasing Iran is disgusting and deeply un-American. Mr. Speaker, let's stop pretending that we can move forward with the transfer of resources to a regime that wishes to destroy us and our allies. Let's stop pretending that we can negotiate with a regime that wishes genocide on the Jewish people. I strongly support the underlying legislation to halt this administration's reckless policy towards Iran, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, let me just again point out that my friends on the other side of the aisle blocked most of the amendments that were brought before the Rules Committee. In fact, they have a habit of even blocking a majority of their own members' amendments. And even with this rigged process that we've been operating under, that the Republicans have put into place, even under this rigged process, and they've yet to rebut this, they've accomplished nothing. They've accomplished nothing. They've normalized dysfunction, and a win for this majority is having Democrats keep the lights on for them so that we don't shut the government down. I mean, I brought this chart out before, but this is a contrast of like what we accomplished when we were in charge. I mean, I could go right down to these are things, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, honoring our PACT Act, helping our veterans get additional health care, the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, the Inflation Reduction Act, I go Safer Communities Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the Paycheck Protection Program and Health Care Enhancement Act. These are things that pass the House and the Senate and get signed by the President. These are real things. And here we are today doing what we did last week, bringing up all these, right-wing MAGA amendments with appropriations bills that are so bad that even Republican members on the Appropriations Committee do not want to vote for them in full committee, so we bypass that. And then they come to the floor, and we're going to debate the amendments that are in order, they made in order, all day and all night, only to have them pull this stuff at the end of the day. That's what they did last week. Two bills were just, after all the time on the floor debating, were just pulled. And I get it. I mean, we sign up for this. But I will be honest with you, I think it's a disservice to the staff who work up here and who take this job seriously to go through all of these kind of, gyrations for no reason at all. I mean, it is just ridiculous. But I mean, this majority, as we come to the close of this week, and we will hopefully break for Thanksgiving, has accomplished nothing. This has been a waste of time. You want to talk about a waste of taxpayer money? It is the Republican majority in this House. And at this point, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from New Mexico, a distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, indeed, today we have yet another extreme Republican appropriations bill that focuses more on tax breaks for the wealthy tax cheats than keeping our community safe. When asked what bothers them most about taxes, nearly 2/3 of Americans said the feeling that the wealthy and corporations are not paying their fair share. But instead of making sure the IRS has the tools it needs to go after wealthy tax cheats, this bill slashes their budget by $22 billion. For every dollar cut from IRS law enforcement, we tend to lose $2 in tax revenue. Republicans are clearly bad at budgeting when they are giving away revenue. But wait, there's more. Republicans like to say they are the party of law and order, but this bill also cuts the FBI's law enforcement by $400 million. Cutting the FBI's budget would hurt our rural communities. FBI agents can bring in technology and tools that help solve crimes that a small police force, like in my district, just don't have. How can we expect to interdict fentanyl in our rural areas or to go after criminal cartels when we are cutting the FBI and cutting the Department of Justice, which would prosecute those despicable traffickers of death and despair? Republicans are clearly bad at making sure criminals are investigated, charged, tried, and sent to prison. But wait, that's not all. While Democrats are putting people over politics and growing the middle class, the extreme Republican appropriation bills are blockading the road to the middle class. This appropriation bill cuts the pathway to prosperity when it cuts economic development programming to 51% below last year's levels. In New Mexico, these cuts would jeopardize local and tribal economic development projects, which are helping us grow jobs and businesses after the closure of coal mines and coal plants. These cuts would take economic development funding down to a level not seen since 2014. Extreme Republicans are clearly looking backward. My focus in Congress must be towards a future of hope, prosperity, and opportunity. At the Rules Committee yesterday, Republicans told me they didn't have a choice but to make these cuts. That's not true. Remember, they are choosing to give up billions of dollars of tax revenue owed by wealthy tax cheats. Republicans built the deficit. In 2017, 2003, and 2001, Republicans chose tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations. Their choices tell us their priorities. With that, Mr. Speaker, I have no other choice but to urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule, and if we ever see it on the floor, this bill.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if I had a nickel for every time the other side of the aisle uses the word extreme, I'd buy you lunch today. It must be poll tested. Extreme must be good for them in the polls. But let me tell you what's extreme and what every American thinks is extreme. $33.7 trillion is extreme. The fact that we are now paying this year $1 trillion in interest on that debt, on that national debt, that's extreme. Spending money we don't have is extreme. Funding an FBI that targets its own citizens who've done nothing wrong. Funding the censorship of speech of Americans. That's extreme. And the American people know that's extreme. The inflation that's caused by this is extreme, and it's affecting everybody. The cost of transportation, the cost of food, the cost of housing is skyrocketing. That's extreme. Now, my colleague mentioned that we didn't allow every amendment in this rule. Well, as a ranking member of the committee, surely he knows, not every amendment's in order. We have certain rules in the Rules Committee. And a lot of these amendments, unfortunately, and I have to tell some of my friends this, failed our own tests. For instance, they weren't germane to the underlying bill. Americans don't want us adding amendments.
Order. The gentleman may resume.
Americans don't want amendments tacked onto bills that have nothing to do with the underlying bill. So the amendments have to be germane. We're protecting the American people when we keep this process for allowing amendments that are only germane. The amendments to spending bills, as a rule, it's been a rule since I've come here 11 years ago, they can't increase spending. Yet, unfortunately, some of my colleagues introduce amendments that do, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but especially the Democrats like to increase spending. We can't allow those amendments. And finally, we don't allow the amendments that try to legislate on an appropriations bill. We don't allow you to change laws on a bill that has to do with spending. So that's the primary reason most of those amendments that the other side of the aisle is complaining about are not in this bill. But there are 119 good amendments that were allowed, that we will debate later today, and that we will vote on in full transparency and full light of day, not snuck in at the last moment. But the American people will get to see how they're being represented through these 119 amendments. This appropriations bill, I would like to point out, satisfies some of our constitutional obligations. You know, Adam Smith said there are three primary roles of government: to provide for the national defense, to fund public infrastructure, and to institute a system of justice. It's that third obligation that we are fulfilling here today with this bill. And then we have some constitutional obligations beyond that are fulfilled in this bill. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, intellectual property, which is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the Constitution. That's an obligation of Congress to provide for the protection of intellectual property. That's in this bill. The Bureau of the Census is funded in this bill. We are directed by the Constitution to have a census every 10 years. So that's another function in this bill. This bill funds the National Institute of Standards and Technology, sometimes called NIST. This used to be called the Bureau of Weights and Measures. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, directs Congress to establish the weights and measures so that we're not all using in this country a different set of weights and measures. So there are many constitutional obligations provided for in this bill, many necessary roles of government, some things that aren't technically in the Constitution, but we agree publicly that these are in the benefit of our country. For instance, NASA is funded in this bill. So that's why I urge my colleagues to support this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I don't even know where to begin. This is what you're witnessing here is called smoke and mirrors. The gentleman says they're not going to sneak things into a bill at the last minute. A whole bunch of stuff was snuck into this bill at the last minute. In fact, I repeat, this bill did not go before the full Appropriations Committee. It was not reported out by the full Appropriations Committee. Why? Because it is so extreme and so awful they didn't think they had the votes. The same thing last week. Again, 2 appropriation bills. We wasted all this time on the floor talking about those bills, and then they pulled them because they didn't have the votes. You know, and here we are again voting on another extreme bill that will probably, in all likelihood, be pulled. And when the gentleman is making the case that somehow amendments are blocked because, you know, they're not rule compliant, okay, all right, that's an argument to be made, but that's not the case with the overwhelming majority of the amendments that were blocked. Again, I said to my Republican friends who were watching, a majority of your amendments were blocked, and you guys are in charge. I get it, they blocked 72% of the amendments I've offered, which, by the way, are rule compliant, but they blocked the majority of Republican amendments. And the gentleman says that, you know, we were just blocking amendments that are not rule compliant. Last night in the Rules Committee, we offered amendments to strike out language that was in the bill, that is in this bill. It is totally rule compliant. We offered an amendment to strike the anti-abortion riders. We had a vote, and the gentleman voted with the majority of Republicans to block us even being able to offer an amendment to strike the anti-abortion riders. I guess they were afraid they would lose, or afraid of the debate, or afraid to put vulnerable members in a tough position, whatever. We had an amendment striking anti-LGBTQ riders. Again, all the Republicans, the gentleman included, voted to block it. Totally rule compliant. We had an amendment striking the anti-gun safety riders that were added into this bill. Totally rule compliant. Every Republican, including the gentleman, voted to not make our amendment in order. Yeah, so this is what you call smoke and mirrors. I mean, we had an amendment striking their anti-climate riders. Again, it's in the bill. We're not putting something new in the bill. This is their bill. Totally rule compliant. Every Republican, including the gentleman, voted to block that. So let's not have this, you know, kind of fantasy debate where we're saying, oh, all we did was we kept out amendments that were not rule compliant. Bottom line is, you're afraid of the debates. My friends are afraid that they may lose on some of these issues. They also know that the majority of the American people do not like their position on women's reproductive rights, where they want a national abortion ban. They also know that a majority of people in this country are sick and tired of bigotry against the LGBTQ+ community. They know that a majority of Americans are sick and tired of the rising level of gun violence in this country. They also know that a majority of Americans believe climate change is for real. And they want us to do stuff to try to reverse the current trends. But they blocked all these amendments. And I have the report from the Rules Committee last night with all the votes and the amendments, all rule compliant. All rule compliant. So, you know, let's get real here. We are here today to, again, talk about an appropriation bill that is not only extreme, that probably at the end of the day not even going to be able to pass it with Republican votes. And it will certainly never become law. It will certainly, it's a joke of a bill. They wouldn't even bring it before the full Republican-controlled Appropriations Committee. And then, or they're going to pull it. And that's it. We have you want to talk about wasting money? All the money we wasted last week debating bills that are going nowhere. Or what about the money that we wasted while for 26 days we had no Speaker of the House, but had to keep everybody here while they try to fight amongst themselves on which member of the Republican Congress they disliked the least so they can move that person forward as Speaker. I mean, give me a break. I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Well, I look forward to the passage of this rule because there are 119 amendments that are going to expose 430-plus members of this body to their voters. Well, how is that? Well, each of these amendments gets 10 minutes of debate, and then if so ordered, there will be recorded votes on these amendments, and they address issues fundamental to our rights. There will be amendments in this debate after this rule passes on protecting the First Amendment, the Constitution, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Will we allow our government to censor us on social media? They've been doing it through NGOs and private organizations and research grants. I don't think we should allow it. I don't think it's constitutional. You can't launder a violation of the First Amendment. And there will be a debate on that after this rule passes because of this rule. There'll be a debate on whether you support the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. There's an amendment that we will debate when this rule passes that prohibits the ATF from using funds to maintain a database. They're prohibited already, but they keep trying to do it, so we have to defund them from that. There's even an amendment, and I'm particularly fond of this debate that's coming up, to prevent federal funds from being used to prosecute a presidential candidate. We look like a banana republic when our justice system indicts candidates for president to try to bring down their poll numbers. This is something that you do in third world countries. In any event, there are 119 amendments. I think the other side is against this rule because they don't want to have these debates. And they surely don't want to have to vote, because that record will be for all time. And every 2 years, each of us faces our voters with those records that will be created today as a result of this rule. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah. So I think I'm beginning to understand the logic of the gentleman from Kentucky. So he thinks we have an open process as long as amendments that he agrees with are made in order. But any amendments that he doesn't agree with, it's okay to block them. I don't have any problem with some of the crummy amendments that the gentleman and the Republicans have made in order, that in my opinion are really bad for this country. We'll have those debates and we'll vote on them. I have no problem with that. But I don't know why my friends are afraid to have a debate on women's reproductive rights, whether or not we should protect a woman's right to choose, whether we should protect a woman's right to abortion in this country. I mean, they blocked it. They added language in that curtails women's rights, but they won't allow an amendment so we can have that 10 minutes of debate. I don't know why the gentleman's afraid to have a debate on whether or not we should end bigotry against the LGBTQ plus community. If they believe that it's okay to continue prejudice and discrimination against that community, they can vote no on our amendment. I mean, that's Let's have the debate, or on climate change, or even on, we have a different position on assault weapons. The gentleman can offer his amendment. We have a different amendment. Why is it that the amendment that we offered is blocked? It's just a strange view of the world when you come up here and you say that we have a very fair and open process here. But we block all your amendments, but we're making all the amendments that we agree with basically in order. I don't really think that's a fair process. But in any event, let me ask the gentleman. I don't know. How many more speakers does he have on his side?
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
Then, Mr. Speaker, I will yield myself the remaining time on our side.
Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, House Republicans are a minority party that is masquerading as a majority party. And I say that because I think my friends on the other side don't want to actually be in charge anymore. It is easier to be in the minority when you're a Republican. They think all you have to do is vote no on everything. It's harder to be in the majority. And it's especially hard because the Republican Party no longer represents a coherent political ideology that seeks to solve problems or govern. They just want to scream and yell about how this place is broken when they're the ones who broke it. They want to use crisis and scandal to mask their own selfishness and sedition and to cover up their own incompetence and ineffectiveness. But the American people see through it. They know this Republican majority is a disaster, a national embarrassment. They have normalized dysfunction. We have Republican members of Congress literally assaulting each other in the hallways, threatening to punch people in committee hearings, getting into fights on the House floor and having their supporters threaten each other's families with violence. That is the truth. They have wasted away their majority fighting amongst themselves and acting like babies, focusing on retaliation and revenge, pursuing ridiculous impeachment inquiry sideshows, conditioning aid to our allies on tax cuts for billionaires here at home, screaming about the deficit when they keep passing bills that blow up the deficit. And I say to people watching this at home, you might not agree with Democrats on everything, but we are Team Normal. And Republicans are Team totally off the deep end nuts. I clean that up for the floor, Mr. Speaker, for, civility. Democrats ran this place like professionals, and Republicans are running it into the ground. Democrats fight for the people. Republicans only care about fighting with each other. Democrats behave like adults, and I hope rational, reasonable, moderate Republicans, if any are left, will join us and reject the MAGA extremists who behave like spoiled, rotten children. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge a held no on this rule, a no on the underlying bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Well, the word of the day is extreme, because the other side uses it in every sentence. But let me tell you what's extreme. Violating the First Amendment, principles of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that's extreme. That's going to be addressed in this bill and this rule, using the power of the purse. Violating the Second Amendment rights of Americans, God-given rights to defend themselves, that's extreme. This bill addresses that. This rule provides for robust debate on that issue. Violating the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and the rights there enshrined. Violating the 10th Amendment, federalizing our police forces. That's extreme. These are the things that Americans find extreme. These are the things that are addressed in this rule and in the underlying bill using the power of the purse. But the most extreme thing, and I do have to say, the Democrats are really good at this form of extremism. The most extreme thing is to continually spend money we don't have, to borrow until they won't lend us any more money, and then to print money so that we can spend more of it, to put ourselves $33.7 trillion in debt. And when I say ourselves, I mean the American taxpayers. They're on the hook for this. And even if you don't pay taxes, if you've worked a hard life and you've saved and you've got money in the bank and you're relying on your Social Security, what's extreme is the inflation that we have created through out-of-control spending in this chamber over many, many years, both parties guilty of it. That's extreme because it hurts every American when we devalue the dollar through extreme spending. What does this bill do? It cuts spending. This fight is really simple. The disagreements between both sides of the aisle, we can argue about the minor issues, but the major issue is, do you want to expand government? Do you want it to be more prevalent in your life? Do you want to pay more taxes? Do you want to put your grandkids in hock? If you do, vote for that side of the aisle. If you want to put us on a path to fiscal responsibility, if you want to have open debates, if you want to have 72 hours to see what's in the bill, if you don't want to have to vote for a bill to find out what's in it, then you're with this side of the aisle, and you should support this rule. And I urge adoption of this rule, and I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.